I suppose I should have known better than to trust a landlord who smiled too much. It was late autumn in 1884 when I arrived in Prague. The city was all narrow cobblestone streets and soot-stained buildings that leaned into one another like old men sharing secrets. I'd come from London on family business, sorting through the estate of a distant uncle I'd never met, a man whose death had been both unexpected and, frankly, convenient for my financial situation. The inheritance wasn't vast, but it was enough to buy a modest home and start fresh somewhere quieter, somewhere that didn't remind me of everything I'd failed at back in England. Řetězová street was tucked into the Staré Město, the old town, just a few minutes' walk from the river. The house itself was narrow, 3 stories tall, with a slate roof and windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the glass look almost amber. The landlord, a man named František Novak, round-faced and perpetually damp around the forehead, had shown me the property twice before I'd agreed to purchase it. Completely rebuilt, he'd said, gesturing broadly at the walls, the floors, the ceiling beams. Old foundation, yes, but everything else is new. You won't find a sturdier home in all of Prague, Mr. Ashford. I'd nodded, walking through the empty rooms, my footsteps echoing on the bare wooden floors. The house smelled of fresh plaster and sawdust. There was a small parlor on the ground floor, a modest kitchen, and a narrow staircase that led up to 2 bedrooms and an attic space I'd probably never use. It was more than adequate for a single man with no family and few belongings. Why was it rebuilt? I'd asked, pausing at the top of the stairs. Novak had hesitated just for a moment before waving a hand dismissively. Oh, you know how these old places are. Foundations settled, walls cracked, easier to start fresh than patch it all up. The previous owners, they moved on years ago. No trouble, no fuss. That should have been my first clue. The way he said, moved on. Not sold, not relocated, moved on. But I was tired, and the price was fair, and I signed the papers that same afternoon. I moved in on a Tuesday. The weather had turned cold, and a fine mist hung over the city, clinging to the rooftops and making everything look softer, older. I'd hired a cart to bring my things, 2 trunks of clothes, a few books, a writing desk I'd inherited from my father, and not much else. The driver helped me carry everything inside, grunting as we hauled the desk up the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor bedroom I'd chosen for myself. When he left, I stood in the middle of the empty parlor and listened to the silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the kind that pressed against your ears, made you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. The kind that made you feel like you were waiting for something, even though you didn't know what. I shook off the feeling and got to work unpacking. The first night was uneventful. I'd made a simple supper, bread, cheese, a bit of cured meat I'd bought from a vendor near the Charles Bridge, and eaten it in the kitchen while reading by lamplight. The house creaked a bit as it settled, the way old buildings do, but nothing unusual. I went to bed around 10, exhausted from the move, and fell asleep almost immediately. It was the second night when things started. I woke to the sound of footsteps, not loud, not heavy, just footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor directly above me, in the attic. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, my heart starting to pick up speed. The footsteps paused, then continued, back and forth, like someone pacing. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe a rat, a very large, very bipedal rat. But the footsteps didn't stop. Finally, I threw off the blankets and lit the candle on my bedside table. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. I grabbed the candle and made my way out into the hallway, then up the narrow staircase to the attic door. It was closed, just as I'd left it. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. Nothing. I waited a full minute, my hand on the doorknob, before finally turning it and pushing the door open. The attic was empty. Just bare beams and dusty floorboards and a single small window that looked out onto the street below. No rats, no intruders, no explanation for the footsteps I clearly heard. I stood there for a long moment, the candle trembling slightly in my hand, before finally closing the door and heading back downstairs. I didn't sleep well the rest of that night. The next morning, I went to see Novak. His office was in a cramped building near the powder tower, up 2 flights of stairs that smelled like boiled cabbage and old tobacco. He looked surprised to see me, his damp forehead glistening in the dim light from the window behind his desk. "Mr. Ashford," he said, half rising from his chair, "is everything all right at the house?" "I heard footsteps last night," I said, not bothering with pleasantries, "in the attic, but when I checked, there was no one there." He blinked at me, then sat back down slowly. "Footsteps?" "Yes, footsteps." He scratched the side of his nose, thinking, "Old houses make noises, Mr. Ashford. The beams expand and contract with the temperature. It can sound like all sorts of things. It sounded like footsteps. Well," he spread his hands, "I assure you there's no one living in your attic. Perhaps a bird got in? Or a stray cat?" I stared at him. "A cat that walks back and forth in a straight line for 10 minutes? He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable now. "I don't know what to tell you, Mr. Ashford. The house was completely rebuilt. There's nothing wrong with it." "You said the previous owners moved on. Where did they move to?" His expression flickered, just for a second. Then the smile returned tight and unconvincing. "I don't know the details. It was years ago. They left, the house fell into disrepair, and I bought the property and had it rebuilt. That's all." I didn't believe him, but I also didn't have any proof, so I thanked him curtly and left. That night, I stayed awake. I sat in the parlor with a book open on my lap, pretending to read, but really just listening, waiting. The footsteps started again around midnight. This time, they weren't in the attic. They were on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, coming down from the second floor. I set the book aside and stood, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. I turned toward the hallway. Nothing. No one. Just the empty doorway and the faint smell of something I couldn't quite place. Something old, damp, like wet stone. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, before finally going back to my chair. I didn't sleep at all that night. Chapter 2. The Smell of Wet Stone. By the 4th night, I'd stopped trying to rationalize it. There was something in the house. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew it wasn't rats, wasn't the wind, wasn't the beams settling. It was something else, something that moved through the rooms when I wasn't looking, that left behind that faint smell of damp stone, and something older, something I didn't have a name for. I'd spent the daylight hours walking through Prague trying to clear my head, The city was beautiful in a way that felt almost oppressive. Too many centuries stacked on top of one another. Too many ghosts lingering in the alleyways and courtyards. I'd crossed the Charles Bridge twice, staring down at the Vltava River as it churned past, dark and cold. I'd bought a meat pastry from a street vendor and eaten it without tasting it. I'd sat in a cafe and watched people pass by, all of them living their ordinary lives, none of them haunted by footsteps in the night. When I returned to Řetězová Street that evening, the house looked the same as always, narrow, quiet, unremarkable. I let myself in and locked the door behind me. That night, the disturbances started earlier. I was in the kitchen, heating water for tea, when I heard something fall in the parlor. A heavy thud, like a book hitting the floor. I set the kettle down and walked to the doorway. One of the books from my desk, a volume of Tenants I'd been reading the night before, was lying in the middle of the floor. Not near the desk, not near the shelf. In the middle of the room, as if someone had picked it up and dropped it there deliberately. I stared at it for a long moment, then crossed the room and picked it up. The pages were still warm, as if someone had been holding it. I set it back on the desk, my hands trembling slightly, and returned to the kitchen. The kettle was no longer on the stove. I found it in the parlor, sitting on the floor, next to where the book had been. I didn't drink tea that night. I sat in my bedroom with the door locked and a candle burning on the bedside table, listening to the house breathe around me. That's what it felt like the house was breathing, expanding and contracting, settling into itself, making small noises that weren't quite footsteps, but weren't quite nothing either. Around midnight, I heard voices, not loud, not clear, just a low murmur, like two people speaking in another room, their words muffled by walls and distance. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I could hear the rhythm of conversation. One voice, then another, then the first again. I sat very still, barely breathing, and tried to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from below, from the ground floor. I didn't want to go downstairs. Every instinct I had told me to stay in the room, keep the door locked, wait until morning. But the voices continued, soft and insistent, and finally, I couldn't stand it any more. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. The house was dark except for the faint glow of my candle. The voices had stopped. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. Nothing. I descended slowly, one step at a time, the old wood creaking under my weight. When I reached the ground floor, I paused again, holding the candle high. The parlor was empty. The kitchen was empty. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, but the smell was stronger now, that wet stone smell, and something else beneath it, something metallic, like old copper. I walked through the rooms, checking corners, peering into shadows, but found nothing out of place. When I returned to the staircase, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were wet footprints on the floor, not large, not small, just footprints. 2 sets of them side by side, leading from the front door to the base of the stairs, then stopping. I crouched down and touched one with my fingertip. It was cold and damp, and when I lifted my finger, it came away smudged with something dark, not water, something thicker. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the parlor with every candle in the house lit, staring at the footprints until they dried and faded into nothing, leaving only faint stains on the floorboards. When morning came, I left the house and went straight to the city archives. The archives were housed in a stone building near the old town square, up a winding staircase that seemed to go on forever. The air inside was cool and smelled like old paper and dust. A clerk, a thin, stooped man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up as I approached his desk. "I need records," I said, "for a property on Řetězová Street, number 14. He raised an eyebrow. "What kind of records?" "Ownership, previous tenants, anything you have." He nodded slowly and disappeared into the stacks, returning a few minutes later with a ledger bound in cracked leather. He set it on the desk and flipped through the pages, his finger tracing down columns of cramped handwriting. "Řetězová 14, he murmured. "Yes, here, property purchased in 1881 by František Novák. Prior to that," he squinted at the page, "owned by the Dvořák family, Tomáš and Anna Dvořák. Do you have records of what happened to them?" He turned a few more pages, then paused. "Ah, yes, there's a note here. Both deceased, 1878. "How did they die?" The clerk looked up at me, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't say." "Doesn't say?" "No, just deceased, both on the same date." He tilted the ledger so I could see. There, in faded ink, Tomáš Dvořák, deceased 12th of March, 1878. Anna Dvořák, deceased 12th of March, 1878. "Is there any other information? Cause of death? Circumstances?" He shook his head. "You'd need to check the parish records for that, or the police archives if there was an investigation." I thanked him and left. The parish church of St. Giles was a short walk from the archives, its tall spire visible above the rooftops. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the smell of old wood. A priest, a young man with a kind face, greeted me near the altar. "I'm looking for burial records," I said, "for Tomáš and Anna Dvořák, March 1878. He nodded and led me to a small side room where the parish records were kept. It took him a few minutes to find the right volume, but eventually he laid it open on a narrow wooden table. "Here," he said, pointing to an entry, "Tomáš and Anna Dvořák, buried 15th March 1878. "Does it say how they died?" The priest hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There's a note here. It says they were found in their home, both of them. The house was in poor condition. The entry suggests they may have died from exposure or perhaps illness, but—" He frowned. "There's something else written here. In the margin." He tilted the book toward me. In the margin, in a different hand, someone had written a single word in Czech, "Utonuli." "What does that mean?" I asked. The priest looked at me, his expression troubled. "It means drowned." I walked back to Řetězová Street in a daze. Drowned, in their own home. It didn't make sense. The house was nowhere near the river. There was no well, no cistern, nothing that could explain how two people could drown inside a residential building. Unless something else had happened, something the records didn't or couldn't explain. When I reached number 14, I stood outside for a long time, staring up at the windows. The afternoon light made them glow amber again, warm and inviting. But I knew better now. I knew what was inside. Chapter 3, The Water in the Walls. I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I stood on the cobblestones of Řetězová Street, staring at the house as the afternoon light began to fade. Around me, the city continued its rhythm. A woman in a dark shawl hurried past, carrying a basket of bread. A lamplighter made his way down the street with his long pole. Two children chased each other around a corner, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Normal life, ordinary life. And here I was, standing in front of a house where two people had drowned. I tried to picture it, Tomasz and Anna Dvořák, whoever they'd been, however they'd lived. Had they been old, young? Had they had children, friends, neighbors who missed them? And how had they drowned inside a building that had no water source beyond a small kitchen pump? The word kept circling in my mind. Utonuli, drowned. Finally, as the last of the daylight bled from the sky, I forced myself to unlock the door and go inside. The house felt different. I can't explain it better than that. It was the same rooms, the same walls, the same creaking floorboards. But something had shifted. The air felt heavier, damper, like walking into a cellar that hadn't been opened in years. And that smell, wet stone and old copper, was everywhere now, clinging to everything. I lit the lamps in the parlor and kitchen, trying to drive back the shadows, but it didn't help much. The light seemed dimmer than usual, swallowed up by the dark corners and the narrow hallways. I made myself a simple meal, more bread, some pickled vegetables, and ate it, standing at the kitchen counter, too restless to sit. My mind kept returning to the archive records, to the priest's troubled expression, to that single word scrawled in the margin. Drowned. After I'd forced down the last of the food, I washed my plate in the basin and dried it with a cloth. When I set the plate back on the shelf, I noticed something. The cloth was damp, not just damp, soaking wet. I stared at it, my stomach tightening. I just pulled it from the drawer. It had been dry. I was certain of it. I wrung it out over the basin, and water streamed from it, far more than should have been possible. The water was cold and smelled faintly of river mud. I dropped the cloth and stepped back. From somewhere above me, the second floor, I thought, I heard a sound like water running, like someone had left a tap open. I grabbed a lamp and climbed the stairs. The sound was clearer up here. It was coming from my bedroom. I was sure of it. A steady flow, like water pouring from a height. I pushed open the bedroom door. The room was empty. The bed neatly made. Everything exactly as I'd left it that morning. But the sound continued, rushing water close enough that I should be able to see the source. I walked slowly around the room, holding the lamp high. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster and listened. Yes, there. Water moving through the structure of the house, flowing somewhere behind the walls, above the ceiling, below the floor. A hidden river running through the bones of the building. I pulled back and stared at the wall. This house had been completely rebuilt, Novak had said. New walls, new floors, new everything. So where was the water coming from? I spent the next hour checking every room in the house. The sound of running water followed me everywhere. In the attic, it seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. In the parlor, it echoed from the ceiling. In the kitchen, it rushed behind the plaster near the stove. But there were no leaks, no damp spots, no visible water anywhere, just the sound and the smell and the growing certainty that something very wrong had happened in this house, something that hadn't been washed away when Novak rebuilt it. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat in the parlor with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, a lamp burning on the table beside me, and waited. The footsteps started around 11. This time, they were on the ground floor, moving slowly through the kitchen. I heard the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, then the creak of a door opening. The smell of wet stone grew stronger. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the kitchen doorway. The room was dark, except for the faint glow from the parlor lamp behind me. But I could see movement. Just a shadow, really. A darker patch of darkness near the far wall, shifting slightly as if someone was standing there. "Who are you?" I said. My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't move. I stepped into the kitchen, holding the lamp out in front of me. The light pushed back the darkness, revealing the familiar shapes of the table, the stove, the shelves. The shadow was gone. But standing in the middle of the floor, in the exact spot where the footprints had been the night before, was a puddle of water. I knelt down and touched it, cold, dark. And when I brought my fingers to my nose, I smelled river mud and something else, something organic and decaying. I stood up quickly, wiping my hand on my trousers, and backed out of the kitchen. The puddle remained, glistening in the lamplight. I returned to the parlor and tried to think. Drowned. The Dvořáks had drowned in this house in 1878, 6 years ago. And then Novak had bought the property, torn it down, rebuilt it. But he hadn't gotten rid of them. Whatever had killed Tomáš and Anna Dvořák was still here, still moving through the rooms, still leaving puddles and wet footprints and the smell of cold river water. I thought about leaving, packing my things, walking out the door, finding a hotel for the night, and never coming back. But this was my house now. I'd spent nearly all of my inheritance on it. I had nowhere else to go. And more than that, more than the practicality of it, I felt something else. A stubborn refusal to be driven out by shadows and strange smells and sounds I didn't understand. If the Dvořáks were still here, I needed to know why. I needed to know what had happened. The next morning, I went to see the neighbors. The house to the left of mine was occupied by an elderly woman named Pani Zemanova. She answered the door slowly, peering at me through the gap with suspicious, rheumy eyes. "Yes? I'm your new neighbor," I said in halting Czech. I'd been studying the language since arriving in Prague, but my accent was still terrible. "Number 14. I wanted to introduce myself. Samuel Ashford." She looked me up and down, then nodded curtly. "English?" "Yes, I've recently moved here. I was wondering if you knew anything about the previous owners of my house, the Dvořáks." Her expression changed. The suspicion was replaced by something else, something that looked like pity, or maybe fear. "You should not have bought that house," she said quietly. "Why not?" She glanced past me toward number 14, then back at my face. "Bad things happened there. Bad things." "What kind of bad things?" She shook her head. "I don't speak of it. You should leave. Sell the house. Go back to England." "I can't. Please, if you know something, I need to hear it." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she sighed, a heavy, tired sound, and opened the door wider. "Come inside, quickly." Her parlor was cramped and smelled like cabbage and old wool. She gestured for me to sit in a worn armchair, then lowered herself into a chair across from me, her hands folded in her lap. "The Dvořáks," she said slowly. "They were good people. Tomáš was a clerk. Anna kept house. They had no children. They lived quietly, caused no trouble." "What happened to them?" She looked down at her hands. The winter of 1878 was very cold. The river froze. There was snow for weeks. And then in March, the thaw came. The ice broke. The river flooded. I leaned forward. The house flooded? No, not exactly. She frowned, searching for the right words. The water rose. It came up through the ground, through the old cellars and foundations. Many houses in this part of the city have problems when the river floods. Water seeps in, walls crack, cellars fill. And the Dvořáks? Her expression darkened. They were found in their home, both of them, in the parlor. The water had come in during the night. It filled the ground floor. They could not get out. The door was blocked. The windows were too small. They drowned in their own home while the city slept. I felt cold all over. Why didn't they call for help? Some say they did. Some say the neighbors heard cries, but thought it was the wind. Others say the house was cursed, that the water came too fast, that it was not natural. She crossed herself. After they died, no one would live there. The house stood empty for 3 years. Then Novak bought it, tore it down, and rebuilt. He thought that would be enough, but the dead do not forget. You think they're still there? She met my eyes. I know they are. I have seen lights in the windows at night. I have heard sounds. And others on this street, they know too. We do not speak of it, but we know. I sat back in the chair, my mind racing. Is there anything I can do? I asked. To help them? To make them leave? Pani Semanova shook her head slowly. I do not know. Perhaps a priest, perhaps nothing. The dead keep their own counsel. Chapter 4. The Priest's Refusal. I left Pani Semanova's house with a feeling like lead settling in my stomach. The Dvořáks had drowned in their own parlor, trapped by rising floodwater, unable to escape, crying out for help that never came. And now they were still there, still moving through the rooms, still leaving traces of that cold river water wherever they went. I walked back to number 14 and stood in the doorway of the parlor, trying to imagine it. The water rising in the darkness inch by inch, covering the floor, climbing the walls. The panic, the desperate attempts to break through the door or the windows, the final moments as the water closed over their heads. And then what? What kept them here? Was it the violence of the death, the injustice of it, or was it something else, something I didn't have the words for? I didn't know, but I knew I couldn't live like this, waiting every night for footsteps and voices and the smell of wet stone. I needed help. The Church of Our Lady Before Tin was one of the most prominent in the old town. Its twin Gothic spires, visible from almost anywhere in the district. I'd passed it a dozen times since arriving in Prague, but I'd never gone inside. Now I climbed the steps and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The interior was dim and cool, lit by rows of candles that flickered in the draft. The smell of incense hung in the air, thick and cloying. A few old women knelt in the pews, their heads bowed in prayer. At the far end of the nave, near the altar, I saw a figure in black robes. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing on the stone floor. "Excuse me," I said. "Father?" The priest turned. He was older than the young man at St. Giles, somewhere in his 50s, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. He looked at me with a kind of weary patience. "Yes, my son? I need to speak with you about something that's happening in my home." His expression didn't change. "What kind of something?" I hesitated, suddenly aware of how insane this was going to sound. I believe the house is haunted by the previous owners. They died there, and I think they're still present." The priest studied me for a long moment, then nodded toward a side chapel. "Come, we'll speak privately." We sat on a wooden bench beneath a statue of St. Michael, the stone angel's sword raised above a cowering demon. The priest folded his hands in his lap and waited for me to continue. I told him everything: the footsteps, the voices, the wet footprints in the puddles, the sound of water rushing through the walls, the records I had found at the archives, and the story Pania Zamanova had told me. When I finished, I felt exhausted, as if the telling had drained something vital from me. The priest was silent for a long time. "You're certain of what you've heard and seen?" he finally asked. "Yes." "And you've ruled out natural explanations? Leaking pipes, settling foundations, rats in the walls?" "There are no pipes. The house was completely rebuilt 3 years ago, and rats don't leave puddles of river water or move books from one room to another." He sighed, a deep, troubled sound. "I believe you, Mr. Ashford. I've lived in this city long enough to know that some houses carry their histories with them, no matter how thoroughly they're rebuilt. The earth remembers, the stones remember. Can you help me?" He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I didn't like. Reluctance, maybe even fear. "What you're asking for is an exorcism, or at the very least a blessing of the house to drive out unclean spirits." "Yes, exactly. I cannot do that." I stared at him. "Why not?" "Because the church does not recognize hauntings by ordinary souls, by the dead who were once living Christian people, as demonic possessions. The Dvořáks, if they are indeed still present, are not demons. They are human souls, trapped perhaps, but not evil." "Then what am I supposed to do?" The priest spread his hands. "Pray for them, light candles, ask God to grant them peace and rest, but I cannot perform a rite of exorcism on people who lived and died as faithful Christians. It will be inappropriate, theologically unsound." I felt anger rising in my chest. "So I'm just supposed to live with them? Let them move through my house every night, leaving water and footprints and God knows what else?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Ashford, truly, but there are limits to what the church can do." I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. "Thank you for your time, Father." He rose as well, his expression pained. "I will pray for you, and for them. That's all I can offer." I left without another word. The anger carried me all the way back to Řetězová Street, but by the time I reached number 14, it had faded into something colder. Resignation, maybe, or despair. I let myself in and stood in the parlor, looking around at the ordinary furniture, the ordinary walls, the ordinary floorboards. Nothing looked haunted, nothing looked cursed, but I knew better. That night, I decided to try something different. If the priest wouldn't help, if prayer and candles weren't enough, then I'd have to try something else, something more direct. I waited till midnight, then sat down in the middle of the parlor floor and spoke aloud. "Tomáš, Anna, I know you're here. I know what happened to you. I'm not here to hurt you or drive you out. I just want to understand." My voice sounded small in the empty room. I waited. Nothing. "Please," I said, "if you can hear me, give me a sign. Move something. Make a sound. Anything." For a long moment, there was only silence. And then I heard it. The sound of water, not rushing through the walls this time. Closer, much closer. I looked down. Water was seeping up through the floorboards, pooling around my legs, cold and dark and smelling of river mud. I scrambled to my feet, backing away, but the water followed me, spreading across the floor in thin rivulets, reaching for the walls. And then I saw them, 2 figures standing in the doorway to the kitchen. They were indistinct, more like shadows than solid forms, but I could make out the rough shapes, a man and a woman, standing side by side, not moving, just watching me. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their gaze, cold and heavy and filled with something I couldn't name. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry for what happened to you." The figures didn't respond. They just stood there, silent and still, as the water continued to spread across the floor, and then slowly they began to fade. The water receded. The smell faded. The room returned to normal. But I knew they weren't gone. They were never gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the street outside, waiting for morning. When the first light finally crept over the rooftops, I felt a tiny measure of relief. Daylight made everything seem less impossible. But I knew that when night came again, they would be back, and I still had no idea what to do about it. Over the next few days, I tried to establish some kind of routine. I avoided the house as much as possible during the day, spending hours walking through the city or sitting in cafes, reading newspapers I didn't really absorb. When I had to be home, I stayed in the upstairs bedroom with the door locked, trying to ignore the sounds that drifted through the walls. The disturbances were getting worse. Every night the water came, sometimes just a few puddles, sometimes enough to cover the ground floor entirely, forcing me to retreat upstairs and wait for it to recede. The figures appeared more frequently, too, never speaking, never approaching, just standing in doorways or at the foot of the stairs, watching. I tried speaking to them again, but they never responded. They just watched, and the smell, that wet stone and copper smell, was constant now, clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I was losing weight. I wasn't eating properly. I wasn't sleeping more than an hour or 2 a night. My hands shook when I tried to write or read. I caught myself staring at nothing for long stretches, my mind blank and numb. I knew I couldn't go on like this much longer, but I also knew I had nowhere else to go. It was Pani Zamanova who finally gave me a new direction. I'd gone to her house again, desperate for someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't think I was insane. She'd let me in reluctantly and made me sit while she brewed tea. "You look terrible," she said bluntly. "I feel terrible. The house is getting worse." "Yes." She nodded, as if she'd expected this. It always does. When new people move in, the dead become agitated. "The priest won't help me. He says they're not demons, so he can't perform an exorcism." "Priests," she muttered, "always worried about rules and theology. But there are other ways." I looked up. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then leaned forward. "There is a woman in Malastrana across the river. She knows things, old things, things the church does not speak of." "What kind of woman?" "A wise woman. Some call her a witch, but that is not the right word. She helps people with curses, with hauntings, with things that should not be." "Can she help me?" Pani Zamanova shrugged. "I do not know, but she is the only one I can think of. Her name is Bozhena Kolachova. She lives on Nerudova Street, above a bakery, the building with the red door." I stood up. "Thank you." She caught my arm. Be careful, Mr. Ashford. These things, they are not simple, and they are not safe. I know, but I went anyway. Chapter 5. The Wise Woman of Narrator Street. I crossed the Charles Bridge just after noon, the stone saints watching me from their pedestals as the Vltava churned below. The sky was overcast, threatening rain, and the wind carried the smell of the river, cold and faintly mineral, like the smell that filled my house each night. Malastrana, the lesser town, was older than the old town, if that was even possible. The streets here were narrower, twisting up the hillside toward the castle that loomed above everything. The buildings leaned at odd angles, their facades painted in faded yellows and greens and blues, and everywhere I looked, there were signs hanging above doorways, a golden key, a red eagle, a white swan. Narrator Street climbed steeply, and I found myself out of breath by the time I spotted the bakery. The building above it was narrow and crooked, with a red door just as Pani Zemanova had described. I stood outside for a moment, gathering my courage, then knocked. The door opened almost immediately. The woman who answered was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40, with dark hair streaked with gray and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore a simple dress and an apron dusted with flour, and she looked me up and down with the same appraising expression Pani Zemanova had used. "You're the Englishman," she said. Her check was clear and precise, easier for me to follow than the hurried street dialect I'd been struggling with. "Yes, Samuel Ashford, are you? Bojena Kolacheva, come in." She stepped aside, and I entered. The interior was dim and cluttered. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a pungent, earthy smell. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars and bottles and bundles of things I couldn't identify. A small fire burned in the hearth, and a black cat dozed on a cushion near the warmth. Bojena gestured for me to sit at a wooden table in the center of the room, then poured 2 cups of something that smelled like mint and bark. "Drink," she said. "It will help with the shaking." I hadn't realized I was shaking, but when I looked down at my hands, I saw she was right. I took the cup and sipped. The liquid was bitter, but warming, spreading heat through my chest. "Pani Zemanova sent you," Bojena said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, she said you might be able to help me with my house." "The house on Řetězová Street, number 14. I stared at her. "How did you—" "I know the house. I knew the people who died there." She sat down across from me, her expression somber. "Tomasz and Anna Dvorak. They were good people. They did not deserve what happened." "You knew them?" "I did some work for Anna years ago, a blessing for her garden, a charm for her husband's health. Small things. We were not close, but I remember them." She paused. "And I remember when they died. The whole city felt it. A death like that, sudden, violent, trapped, it leaves a mark." "They're still there," I said quietly. "In the house. I see them. I hear them. The water comes every night." Bojena nodded slowly. "Yes, they would be. They died in fear and pain, unable to escape. That kind of death, it binds the soul to the place. They cannot leave." "Can you help them? Can you help me?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her cup. "Perhaps, but it will not be easy, and it will not be safe. I don't care. I can't go on like this." She looked up at me, her eyes sharp. "You should care, Mr. Ashford. The dead are not toys to be played with. They are not puzzles to be solved. They are human souls, trapped in suffering. If we try to help them and fail, the consequences could be severe for them and for you. What kind of consequences? The kind that leave you trapped as well. I set down my cup, my hands still trembling slightly. What do I need to do? Bojana rose and walked to one of the shelves, running her fingers along the jars until she found what she was looking for. She pulled down a small clay pot and set it on the table. First, you must understand what is happening in your house. The Dvořáks are not simply haunting the building. They are reliving their death. Every night the water rises. Every night they drown again. It is a loop, a cycle they cannot break. Why? Why can't they just move on? Because they do not know they are dead. I blinked. That's impossible. How could they not know? Death is not always clean, Mr. Ashford. When it comes violently, suddenly, the soul can become confused, disoriented. The Dvořáks died in darkness, in cold water, in terror. They may not remember dying. They may think they are still alive, still trying to escape, still calling for help that will never come. The thought made my stomach turn. So what do? We must help them remember. We must show them the truth of what happened. And then, if we are lucky, they will accept it and move on. And if we're not lucky, Bojana's expression darkened, then they will remain, and you will spend the rest of your life living in that house with them, drowning over and over again. She gave me a list of things I would need. Salt. Not table salt, but coarse rock salt from the earth. Candles made from beeswax, not tallow. A bowl of clean water from a spring, not a well or a pump. And something personal that had belonged to the Dvořáks. A piece of clothing, a tool, anything they had touched in life. Where am I supposed to find something of theirs? I asked. The house was torn down. Everything was destroyed. Not everything, Bojana said. Look in the foundation. Look in the cellar if there is one. The old stones remember. Sometimes they hold on to things. I nodded, though I had no idea how I was going to manage this. When you have everything, she continued, come back here. We will perform the ritual at midnight in your house. I will need to be there in the place where they died to help them see the truth. Will it work? She looked at me steadily. I don't know, but it is the only chance they have. I left her house with the clay pot, filled with a mixture of herbs and ash that she said would protect me, and a growing sense of dread. Finding the salt and candles would be easy enough. The spring water would take some searching, but I could manage it. But the personal item, that was going to be difficult. I returned to Řetězová Street as the afternoon light began to fade, and immediately went down to the cellar. I'd only been down here once before, the day I moved in. It was a low, cramped space with a dirt floor and stone walls that glistened with moisture. The air was cold and smelled like earth and rot. A single small window, high in one wall, let in a sliver of gray light. I lit a lantern and began searching. The cellar was mostly empty, a few broken crates, some rusted tools that looked like they'd been left by workmen during the reconstruction, a pile of bricks in one corner. I moved slowly through the space, holding the lantern high, looking for anything that seemed out of place, anything old, anything that might have belonged to the Dvořáks. Near the far wall, half buried in the dirt, I found it. A small wooden box, its surface blackened with age and moisture. I knelt down and carefully dug it out, brushing away the soil. The lid was stuck but I pried it open with the edge of a rusted trowel. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been white but was now gray and rotting, was a simple wooden comb. I lifted it carefully. The comb was small, delicate, clearly made for a woman's hair. Several of the teeth were broken, and the wood was warped from water damage. But it had belonged to someone. I felt certain of that. I wrapped it back in the cloth and placed it in my pocket, then climbed out of the cellar. That night, the disturbances were worse than ever. The water came earlier, around 9 o'clock, and it didn't recede. By 10, the entire ground floor was flooded to a depth of several inches, and I had to retreat upstairs. The smell was overwhelming, thick and choking, and I could hear the sound of water rushing through the walls louder than it had ever been. The figures appeared at the bottom of the stairs just after 11. Tomasz and Anna, standing in the water, staring up at me. I could see them more clearly now than I ever had before. Tomasz was thin and pale, with dark hair plastered to his skull. Anna was smaller, her face gaunt, her eyes wide and empty. Their clothes were soaked, clinging to their bodies, and water dripped from their hair, their hands, their feet. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. I wanted to say something, to tell them I was trying to help, that Božena and I were going to free them, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just stared back. After what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked slowly back into the flooded parlor, disappearing into the darkness. The water began to recede. By midnight, the floor was dry again, and the smell had faded to its usual background presence. I sat on the edge of my bed, exhausted and shaken, and tried to sleep. I didn't succeed. The next day, I gathered the rest of the items Božena had requested. The salt I bought from a merchant near the river who sold minerals and stones for building. The candles came from a chandler's shop in the Jewish quarter, where an old man with a long beard assured me they were pure beeswax. The spring water was harder. I had to walk nearly an hour outside the city to find a spring that hadn't been tainted by wells or runoff, but I managed to fill a glass bottle and seal it carefully. By the time I returned to Malastrana, the sun was setting, and I was exhausted. Božena answered the door before I could knock. "You have everything?" she asked. I nodded and showed her the items. She examined each one carefully, then nodded in approval. "Good. We will go tonight, at midnight. Be ready." "I will." She placed a hand on my arm. "Mr. Ashford, what we are about to do is dangerous. If the Dvořáks do not accept the truth, if they resist, the ritual could fail. You could be hurt. I could be hurt. Do you understand?" "I understand. And you still wish to proceed?" "I have no choice." She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well. I will meet you at your house at 11:30. Do not begin anything without me." Chapter 6. The Midnight Ritual. I spent the remaining hours preparing the house. Božena had given me instructions, specific, detailed instructions, and I followed them as carefully as I could, despite the exhaustion that made my hands clumsy and my vision blur at the edges. First, I cleared the parlor of all furniture, pushing the chairs and table against the walls until there was an open space in the center of the room. Then I used the coarse salt to draw a wide circle on the floor, making sure the line was unbroken. Inside the circle, I placed the 4 beeswax candles at the cardinal points, north, south, east, west, and set the bowl of spring water in the very center. The wooden comb I left in my pocket. Bozhena had told me we would need it later during the ritual itself. When everything was arranged, I stepped back and looked at what I'd created. In the dim lamplight, the circle looked almost alive, the salt gleaming faintly against the dark floorboards. The candles waited unlit. The water in the bowl was perfectly still. It looked like something from a fairy tale, or a nightmare. I wasn't sure which. Bozhena arrived exactly at 11:30. She wore a dark cloak over her dress and carried a leather satchel that clinked softly as she moved. She paused in the doorway of the parlor, studying the circle I'd made, then nodded once. Good. You followed the instructions precisely. Will it work? I asked. That depends on them. She set the satchel down and began unpacking items. Bundles of dried herbs, small clay figurines, a knife with a bone handle. The circle is for our protection. It will keep us safe from the worst of what may happen. But it cannot force the Dvořáks to accept the truth. That choice is theirs. What if they don't choose? She didn't answer. She just continued unpacking, her movements quick and efficient. When she was finished, she looked up at me. Do you have the personal item? I pulled the wooden comb from my pocket and handed it to her. She examined it carefully, running her fingers over the worn wood, then brought it to her nose and inhaled. Yes, she murmured. This belonged to Anna. I can smell her on it. Lavender and lye soap. She looked at me. Where did you find it? In the cellar, buried in the dirt. She nodded. The earth holds on to things, especially things touched by love. She placed the comb carefully beside the bowl of water. Now, we wait. We sat in silence as the minutes crept toward midnight. I could feel my heart beating too fast, my palms slick with sweat. The house was utterly quiet, no footsteps, no water sounds, no voices. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. At 5 minutes to midnight, Bozhena stood and lit the 4 candles. The flames sprang up, bright and steady, casting long shadows across the walls. Step into the circle, she said, and do not leave it no matter what happens. Do you understand? Yes. I stepped over the salt line, careful not to disturb it, and stood beside her in the center. She took my hand. Her grip was strong and dry, and closed her eyes. We call upon the souls of Tomáš and Anna Dvořák, she said, her voice steady and clear. We call upon those who died in this place, in water and darkness, on the 12th of March in the year 1878. We call upon them to come forth, to hear the truth, to remember. The candles flickered, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I saw my breath mist in the air. And then the water came. It didn't seep up slowly this time. It poured through the walls, through the ceiling, through the floor, as if the house had become a sieve. Within seconds, the entire room was flooded to ankle depth, the cold water swirling around the base of the salt circle. But inside the circle, the floor remained dry. I stared down at the salt line, watching the water lap against it but not cross it, and felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. The smell was overpowering now, river mud and copper and decay, and I could hear voices, not the murmur of distant conversation like before. Clear voices, close, speaking Czech, too rapid for me to follow. And then they appeared, Tomáš and Anna, standing just outside the circle, water streaming from their clothes and hair. They looked more solid than they had before, more real. I could see the details of their faces now, the hollow cheeks, the dark shadows under their eyes, the pale, waterlogged skin. They were staring at Bozhena. Anna's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't understand. Bozhena responded in Czech, her voice calm but firm. I caught a few words: voda, water, smrta, death, pravda, truth, but the rest was lost to me. Anna shook her head violently, backing away. Tomasz reached for her, his movements slow and strange, as if he were moving through thick liquid. Bozhena continued speaking, her tone growing more insistent. She reached down and picked up the wooden comb, holding it out toward Anna. Anna stopped, her empty eyes fixed on the comb. Bozhena said something else, a long string of words I couldn't parse, and then she dropped the comb into the bowl of spring water. The effect was immediate. Anna let out a cry, a terrible, wrenching sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, and collapsed to her knees in the water. Tomasz moved toward her, but he was shaken now, his form flickering like a candle flame in the wind. The water around them began to churn, rising higher, swirling in a vortex that centered on the two figures. I watched in horror as it climbed their waists, their chests, their shoulders. They were drowning again. Right in front of us, they were drowning again. Bozhena, I started, but she squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. Do not speak, she hissed. Let them remember. I forced myself to watch. Anna was struggling now, thrashing in the water, her mouth open in a silent scream. Tomasz tried to reach her, but the current pulled him away, spinning him in circles. The water rose higher, covering their necks, their chins, their mouths. And then, just as it reached their eyes, everything stopped. The water froze. The figures froze. Even the candle flame seemed to pause mid-flicker. In the silence, I heard Anna speak. One word, clear and distinct. No. Yes. The water collapsed. It didn't drain away or seep back into the walls. It simply vanished, as if it had never been there at all. The floor was dry. The air was warm. The smell was gone. And Tomasz and Anna were still there, kneeling in the center of the room, but they looked different now. The hollow, empty quality was gone from their faces. They looked human. Sad, but human. Anna was crying. Silent tears running down her cheeks as she stared at the comb floating in the bowl of spring water. Tomasz had his arm around her shoulders, and he was speaking to her softly in Czech, his voice barely audible. Bozhena released my hand and stepped forward, though she remained inside the circle. She spoke to them again, her tone gentle now, almost motherly. Anna looked up at her and nodded slowly. Tomasz said something, a single sentence, and Bozhena nodded in return. Then together the two figures stood. They turned to face each other. Anna reached up and touched Tomasz's face. He covered her hand with his own, and then they began to fade. Not suddenly, not violently, just gently, like mist burning away in sunlight. Within moments, they were gone. The silence that followed was profound. Bozhena let out a long, shaky breath and sank to her knees. I realized I was shaking all over, my legs barely able to support my weight. "Is it over?" I managed to ask. She nodded, not looking at me. Yes, they remembered. They accepted. They are gone now. Where did they go? I don't know. No one does. But they are not here anymore. That much I can promise you. I looked around the room. The candles were still burning. The salt circle was intact. The bowl of water sat undisturbed, the wooden comb floating peacefully on its surface. Everything looked exactly as it had an hour ago, but the house felt different. Lighter, emptier, clean. "What did you say to them?" I asked. Bojena rose slowly, brushing off her skirt. "I told them the truth, that they died. That many years had passed, that they were trapped, reliving their final moments over and over. And I told them that if they accepted this truth, they could leave, they could rest. And Anna said yes. She did. And once she accepted it, Tomasz followed. They went together, as they died together." She picked up the bowl and carefully lifted out the comb, water dripping from its teeth. "This is yours now. Keep it somewhere safe. It is all that remains of them." I took the comb, wrapping it back in the rotting cloth. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I don't know how to repay you." "You already have, by caring enough to help them." She began gathering her things, packing them back into the leather satchel. "The house is clean now, Mr. Ashford. You will have no more disturbances. The dead are at peace, and so should you be." She left shortly after, disappearing into the cold Prague night. I remained in the parlor for a long time, staring at the salt circle on the floor, trying to process everything that had just happened. Finally, exhausted beyond measure, I swept up the salt, extinguished the candles, and moved the furniture back into place. The house was silent, truly silent, for the first time since I'd moved in. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, lay down without bothering to undress, and fell immediately into a deep, dreamless sleep. Chapter 7. The Empty Days. I woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window. For a moment I lay there in confusion, disoriented by the brightness, by the warmth. I couldn't remember the last time I'd slept past dawn. The last few weeks had been a blur of exhausted half-sleep and anxious waking, always listening for the next sound, the next sign that they were there. But the house was quiet. I sat up slowly, my body stiff and aching, and listened. Nothing. Just the ordinary sounds of morning. Birds outside the window, footsteps on the cobblestones below, the distant clatter of a cart passing by. I stood and walked to the window, looking down at Řetězová Street. The city was alive with morning activity. A woman was sweeping the step of the house across the way. 2 men stood on the corner, talking and gesturing. A child ran past, chasing a hoop with a stick. Normal life. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. Relief, yes. But something else, too. Something like loneliness. I spent the day cleaning the house. It didn't need it. Everything was still relatively new, and I'd barely been living there long enough to accumulate much dirt. But I needed something to do. Something to keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. I scrubbed the floors. I wiped down the walls. I washed the windows until they gleamed. I aired out the bedding and beat the dust from the curtains. And all the while, I waited for some sign that it had all been real, that the ritual had actually worked, that Tomasz and Anna were truly gone. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no smell of wet stone, no puddles of water. The house remained stubbornly, perfectly normal. By evening, I was exhausted again, but it was a different kind of exhaustion, physical rather than mental, the kind that comes from honest work rather than fear. I made myself a proper meal, soup and bread and a bit of sausage, and ate it slowly at the kitchen table, savoring each bite. I couldn't remember the last time food had tasted like anything other than ash in my mouth. After I'd washed the dishes and put them away, I sat in the parlor with a book and read by lamplight until my eyes grew heavy. Then I went to bed, and I slept through the entire night without waking once. The days that followed were quiet. I fell into a routine. I woke with the sun, made breakfast, and spent the mornings exploring the city. Prague was endlessly fascinating once I wasn't constantly exhausted and anxious. I wandered through the narrow streets of the Jewish quarter, visited the ancient synagogues, climbed the hill to the castle, and looked out over the red roofs spread below. I began to feel like myself again, or perhaps like a new version of myself, someone who had been through something strange and terrible and come out the other side changed but intact. I wrote letters to acquaintances back in England, vague descriptions of my new life that left out the haunting entirely. I bought Czech language primers and studied them diligently, determined to improve my vocabulary and grammar. I even attended a concert at the Rudolfinum, sitting in the back and letting the music wash over me until I felt something close to contentment. The house on Řetězová street remained peaceful. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake and lie in the darkness listening, half expecting to hear footsteps or the sound of water. But there was never anything, just silence and stillness. I should have been relieved, and I was. But I also felt something else, a kind of absence, as if the house had lost something vital, something that had given it meaning beyond walls and floors and roof. About 2 weeks after the ritual, I went to see Pani Zemanova. She answered the door with her usual suspicious expression, but it softened slightly when she saw my face. "You look better," she said. "I feel better. The ritual worked. They're gone." She nodded slowly. "Good. That is good. Come in. I'll make tea." We sat in her cramped parlor, and I told her everything that had happened. The ritual, the water, the moment when Anna had accepted the truth, and they had both faded away. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into her cup. "You were very lucky," she finally said. "Many people try to help trapped spirits and fail. The dead are stubborn. They do not always want to accept the truth." Bozhena said the same thing. "She is wise. You should thank her properly." "I will. I've been meaning to go back to Malastrana." Pani Zemanova looked at me carefully. "And now? What will you do now?" "I don't know. I suppose I'll just live here, try to make a life." "In that house?" "It's my house now, and it's clean. They're gone." She nodded, but there was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. Doubt, perhaps, or worry. "What is it?" I asked. "Nothing. Just..." She hesitated. "Just be careful, Mr. Ashford. The dead may be gone, but death leaves marks. Some houses never forget what happened inside them." I wanted to ask what she meant, but she stood and began clearing the tea things, and I could tell the conversation was over. That night, I had a dream. I was standing in the parlor in the exact spot where the salt circle had been. The room was dark, except for a faint blue light coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. The air was cold and smelled like winter, and in the corner near the window I saw a figure, not Tomasz or Anna. Someone else, smaller, younger, a child. I tried to move toward it, but my feet wouldn't obey. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The figure turned to look at me. I couldn't see its face, just a dark oval where a face should be, and then I woke up. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and looked around the room. Everything was normal. The moonlight streaming through the window, the familiar shapes of the furniture, the sound of my own breathing. Just a dream, I told myself, just a nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. But I couldn't shake the image of that small figure standing in the corner, that empty, featureless face turning toward me. The next day, I went back to the archives. I told myself I was just being thorough, just making sure I had the full story. But deep down, I think I knew there was more to find. The same clerk greeted me, looking vaguely annoyed at my return. "More questions about Řetězová Street?" he asked. "Yes, the Dvořáks. Tomáš and Anna. Did they have any children?" He frowned and pulled out the same ledger as before, flipping through the pages. "Let me see. Tomáš Dvořák, married to Anna Dvořák née Svobodová. No mention of children in the property records. What about birth records or baptismal records? You'd need to check with the church for that. But if there were children, they would typically be listed in the property transfer documents, especially if they inherited. And there's nothing?" "Nothing." I thanked him and left, but I couldn't let it go. I spent the afternoon at St. Giles, the same church where I'd found the burial records for Tomáš and Anna. The young priest remembered me and helped me search through the baptismal records for the 1870s. We found nothing, no children baptized to Tomáš and Anna Dvořák. No birth records, no death records. The Dvořáks had been childless. So why had I dreamed of a child in my house? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ordinary sounds of a house settling. Every creak made me tense. Every whisper of wind against the windows made my heart race. Around 2 a.m, I gave up and went downstairs. The parlor was dark and cold. I lit a lamp and sat in the chair by the window, the same chair where I'd spent so many sleepless nights during the haunting. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept returning to the dream, to the small figure in the corner, to the empty face. I set the book aside and stood, walking slowly around the room. Everything was exactly as it should be. The furniture in its place, the floorboards clean and dry, no smell of water or stone or decay. And yet something felt wrong. Not wrong in the way it had been before, not threatening or oppressive, just incomplete. As if the ritual had solved one problem but left another untouched. I stopped in the corner where the figure had stood in my dream and crouched down, running my hand over the floorboards. Nothing unusual, just smooth, solid wood. But when I pressed my palm flat against the floor, I felt something, a coldness, not from the air, from below, from beneath the house. I spent the rest of the night thinking. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to go back into the cellar. I needed to search it more thoroughly. If there was something else down there, something I'd missed the first time, I needed to find it. Because whatever I'd seen in the dream, whatever was making me feel this persistent unease, I was certain it had something to do with what lay beneath the house, with what was buried in the foundation. Chapter 8. What Lies Beneath. I waited until mid-morning, when the sun was high and the street outside was full of noise and movement. I told myself it was practical. I'd need the daylight to see properly in the cellar. But the truth was simpler than that. I was afraid, not of ghosts this time. The Dvořáks were gone. I was certain of that. But there was something else, something I couldn't name, a presence that lingered at the edges of my awareness like a shadow just out of sight. I gathered what I needed: 2 lanterns, matches, a shovel I'd bought from a hardware shop near the river, and opened the cellar door. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The cellar looked the same as before: low ceiling, dirt floor, stone walls slick with moisture. The small window, high in one wall, let in a shaft of pale sunlight that only made the shadows deeper by contrast. I lit both lanterns and set them on the ground, creating pools of warm light that pushed back the darkness but couldn't quite banish it. Then I began searching. I moved slowly, methodically, examining every inch of the space. I checked the walls for hidden alcoves or loose stones. I prodded the floor with the shovel, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate a void beneath. I even climbed up on an old crate to examine the ceiling joists, looking for anything unusual. Nothing. After an hour, I sat down on the crate, frustrated and exhausted. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was nothing here. Maybe the dream had been just a dream, and the unease I felt was just the lingering after effect of trauma. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. I picked up one of the lanterns and walked slowly around the perimeter of the cellar again, holding the light close to the walls. And that's when I saw it. In the far corner, partially hidden behind the pile of old bricks, there was a section of wall that looked different from the rest. The stones were newer, cleaner, less weathered by moisture and time. I set the lantern down and began moving the bricks, piling them carefully to one side. My hands were shaking slightly, though I wasn't sure if it was from exertion or anticipation. When the wall was fully exposed, I could see it clearly. Someone had bricked up a section of the cellar. Not recently. The mortar was old and crumbling, but not as old as the rest of the foundation either. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Maybe longer. I picked up the shovel and began chipping away at the mortar. It came away easily, crumbling to dust under the blade. Within 10 minutes, I'd loosened the first stone enough to pull it free. Behind it was darkness. Not just empty space, a deeper darkness, the kind that seemed to swallow light. I pulled away another stone, then another. The opening grew larger, and with it came a smell. Not the wet stone smell of the Dvořáks, something worse, something organic and ancient, like earth that had been sealed away for too long. I hesitated, the shovel trembling in my hands. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stop, to put the stones back, to leave the cellar and never come down here again. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pulled away the rest of the stones and held one of the lanterns up to the opening. Beyond was a small chamber, no more than 6 feet square. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the floor packed earth, and in the center I had to lean closer to be sure I was seeing correctly. In the center of the chamber was a shape, small, wrapped in rotting cloth, partially buried in the dirt. A child. I don't remember climbing out of the cellar. One moment I was standing in that hidden chamber, staring at the small cloth-wrapped form, my mind blank with horror. The next, I was sitting on the floor of my kitchen, gasping for air, my hands clenched into fists so tight my nails were drawing blood from my palms. There was a child's body buried beneath my house, a child who had been walled up in a secret chamber and left to rot in the darkness. How long had it been there? Who was it? How had it died? And why? Why had no one ever found it? I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think. The chamber had been sealed. The mortar was old but not ancient. Someone had built that wall deliberately, hardened the body. And then the house had been torn down and rebuilt, and the cellar had been left mostly untouched because the foundation was the only part of the original structure that remained. Novak had said as much. Old foundation, everything else new, which meant whoever had hidden that body, they'd done it before the Dvořáks died, before the house was torn down, possibly years before. I stood on shaking legs and walked to the window, staring out at the street. I needed to report this. I needed to go to the police, tell them what I'd found. There would be an investigation, questions, probably suspicion directed at me, at least initially. But what choice did I have? A child had been murdered, or at least had died under suspicious circumstances, and their body had been hidden in my cellar. I couldn't just leave it there. But even as I thought this, I felt something else, a presence, faint but unmistakable. The same feeling I'd had in the dream. Someone was in the house with me, not in the way the Dvořáks had been, oppressive and overwhelming, filling every room with water and cold. This was different, smaller, quieter, waiting. I turned slowly, my heart hammering, and there, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the parlor, was the figure from my dream. It was a child, a girl, I thought, though it was hard to be sure. She wore a simple dress that might once have been white, but was now gray and tattered. Her hair hung in long, dark tangles around her face. And her face? Her face was pale and thin, with dark, hollow eyes that stared at me without blinking. She wasn't solid the way Tomáš and Anna had been toward the end. She flickered slightly like a candle flame in a draft. But she was there, undeniably there. "Who are you?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She just stared at me with those hollow eyes. "What do you want?" Still nothing. I took a step toward her, and she moved, not away, but sideways, drifting toward the parlor. She paused at the doorway and looked back at me. She wanted me to follow. I followed her into the parlor. She stopped in the center of the room, in the exact spot where the salt circle had been during the ritual. She looked down at the floor, then up at me, and then she pointed, not at the floor, at the wall, specifically at a section of wall near the window where a small writing desk stood. I walked over slowly and examined the wall. It looked perfectly ordinary. Fresh plaster, clean paint. Nothing unusual. I looked back at the girl. She was still pointing. "I don't understand," I said. "What am I supposed to see?" She didn't respond. She just stood there pointing, her expression blank and patient. I knelt down and ran my hands over the wall, feeling for anything out of place. For a moment, there was nothing, just smooth plaster under my fingertips, and then I felt it, a seam, barely perceptible, but there, running vertically from floor to ceiling, hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster. I pressed against it experimentally. The wall gave slightly, not much, just a tiny bit of flex, as if there was a hollow space behind it. I stood and looked at the girl. "There's something back there?" She nodded, once, slowly. "What is it?" But she was already fading, her form growing thinner and more transparent until she vanished entirely. I was alone in the parlor, but I knew what I had to do. I went back to the cellar and retrieved a crowbar from the pile of tools I'd found during my first search. Then I returned to the parlor and began prying away the plaster. It came off in chunks, revealing a layer of older plaster beneath, and beneath that, brick. Old brick. Part of the original structure, and set into the brick was a small iron door, no more than 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, the kind that might lead to a storage space or a coal chute. The door was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. It took only a few minutes of work with the crowbar to break it. I pulled the door open. Behind it was a crawl space, narrow and dark and smelling of dust and age. And inside, pushed back against the far wall, was a wooden box. I pulled the box out carefully. It was heavier than I'd expected, and something shifted inside as I moved it. I set it on the floor of the parlor and knelt beside it. The lid wasn't locked. It opened easily. Inside were papers, letters by the look of them, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. And beneath the letters, a small leather-bound book. I picked up the book first and opened it carefully. It was a journal, written in Czech, in a careful, precise hand. The first entry was dated 1871. I couldn't read most of it. My Czech was still too rudimentary, but I recognized a few words. Ditya, child, nemocny, sick, smrt, death. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. More entries, more words I couldn't fully understand. But the tone was clear even without translation. This was a record of something terrible, something the writer had been unable to forget or escape. Near the end of the journal, I found a page that made my blood run cold. It was a drawing, crude but clear, a small figure lying in the center of a room, and around it, words written over and over again in increasingly frantic script. Odpust me, odpust me. I didn't need a dictionary to know what that meant. Forgive me. Chapter 9, The Journal of Guilt. I sat on the floor of the parlor, the journal open in my lap, staring at that desperate, repeated plea. Odpust me, odpust me, odpust me. Forgive me. Whoever had written this journal, whoever had hidden it behind that wall, had been consumed by guilt. That much was clear even through the language barrier. I needed to know what it said. I needed to understand what had happened here. I gathered up the journal and the letters, placed them carefully back in the box, and carried everything upstairs to my bedroom. Then I put on my coat and hat and went out into the cold afternoon. I found a translator in the new town, a middle-aged woman named Pani Markova, who worked out of a small office above a tobacconist's shop. She looked surprised when I arrived without an appointment, but she agreed to see me when I explained it was urgent. I need these translated, I said, setting the journal and several of the letters on her desk. From Czech to English as quickly as possible. She picked up the journal and flipped through it, her expression growing more troubled with each page. This is very old and very personal. Are you certain you want this translated? I'm certain it's important. May I ask where you obtained it? From my house. It was hidden in a wall. I need to know what it says. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. I can have it ready for you in 2 days. 3 at most. Can you do it faster? I'll pay extra. She hesitated, then sighed. Tomorrow evening, but it will cost you double my usual rate. That's fine. Thank you. I left the office feeling both relieved and anxious. tomorrow evening seemed impossibly far away. I spent the rest of that day and all of the next in a state of restless tension. I tried to read, but the words wouldn't stick. I tried to walk through the city, but I found myself constantly turning back toward Řetězová Street. I tried to eat, but food tasted like sawdust, and all the while I felt her presence in the house. The girl, the child whose body lay in a hidden chamber beneath the cellar. She didn't appear again, but I knew she was there. I could feel her watching me from doorways, from dark corners, from the space just behind my shoulder, not threatening, not malicious, just present, waiting for what I didn't know. But I hoped the journal would tell me. Pani Markova was waiting for me when I arrived at her office the next evening. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair disheveled as if she'd been working without rest. She handed me a sheaf of papers covered in neat handwriting, her translation of the journal. "This was difficult to read," she said quietly. "I hope you find what you need in it. But I must warn you, Mr. Ashford, it is not a pleasant story." I didn't expect it to be. She nodded and gestured to the papers. "The letters I have not yet finished, but the journal is complete. If you need the letters as well, come back in 2 days. Thank you. This is enough for now." I paid her and left, clutching the translation like a lifeline. I didn't read it until I was back home, sitting in the parlor with every lamp in the house lit. The journal had been kept by a woman named Kristina Mala. She'd been a tenant in the house on Řetězová Street, not an owner, but a lodger, renting a room on the second floor in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The early entries were mundane, notes about her work as a seamstress, complaints about the weather, small observations about the city and her neighbors. But then, in 1871, the tone shifted. Journal entry, 15th April, 1871. "She arrived today. Marketa, my sister's child. Only 7 years old, and already so much trouble has befallen her. My sister died last month. Consumption, the doctor said, though I think it was more the poverty and cold than any disease. Her husband had already left her, gone to Vienna or Berlin or somewhere else where he could forget he'd ever had a family. So now Marketa is mine. I have told her she will live with me, that I will care for her as best I can." She said nothing, just stared at me with those dark eyes. She has not spoken since her mother died. The doctor says it is shock, that it will pass. I hope he is right. Journal entry, 3rd May, 1871. Marketa still does not speak. She eats little and sleeps less. At night, I hear her moving around the room we share, pacing like a caged animal. When I ask her what troubles her, she just shakes her head and turns away. The other tenants in the house have begun to complain. They say she makes strange noises in the night, that she disturbs their sleep, but I hear nothing beyond her restless footsteps. I do not know what to do. I work long hours to afford even this single room. I cannot afford a doctor, and the priests I have spoken to say only that I should pray and be patient. But my patience is wearing thin. Journal entry, 21st June, 1871. Something is wrong with Marketa. I am certain of it now. Last night, I woke to find her standing at the window, staring out at the street. I called her name, but she did not respond. I touched her shoulder, and she was cold. So cold, as if all the warmth had drained from her body. When I finally managed to pull her back to bed, I saw her eyes, empty, like looking into a well with no bottom. I am frightened, not for me, for her. Journal entry, 14th July, 1871. The landlord came to see me today. He says I must find somewhere else to live. The other tenants have complained too many times. They say the child is disturbed, that she frightens them. I begged him to give me more time. I have nowhere else to go. But he was firm. 1 month, he said. Then we must leave. Where will we go? I have no family left, no one who will take us in. I do not know what to do. Journal entry, 8 of August, 1871. Marqueta fell ill 3 days ago. Fever, shaken. She cries out in her sleep, though she still will not speak when awake. I called for a doctor, though I could barely afford it. He gave her medicine, some kind of tonic, and told me to keep her warm and hydrated. But she grows worse. I can see it, the life draining from her little by little. I am afraid she will die, just like her mother, just like everyone I have ever cared for. Journal entry, 15th August, 1871. Marqueta died last night. I was sitting beside her, holding her hand when she took her last breath. It was so quiet, so gentle, like falling asleep. I should have wept. I should have felt something, but all I felt was relief. And then, immediately after, guilt so overwhelming I could barely breathe. The next entry was dated 3 days later. Journal entry, 18th August, 1871. I have done something terrible. I did not know what to do with her body. I had no money for a proper burial, no family to help me. The landlord would not allow me to keep her in the room. He said it was unhygienic, indecent. So I waited until night, and I carried her down to the cellar. There is a small chamber there behind a section of wall that had crumbled away. I thought perhaps I could hide her there, just for a few days, just until I could find a way to bury her properly. But the days passed, and I did nothing. I told myself I would fix it, that I would go to the authorities, explain what had happened, ask for help. But I never did. Instead, I sealed the chamber. I bricked it up myself, working at night when the other tenants were asleep. I told myself it was better this way, that no one would know, that she would rest undisturbed. But I know the truth. I was a coward, and now my niece lies in the darkness beneath this house, and I cannot undo what I have done. Journal entry, 2nd September, 1871. I see her everywhere now, in the corners of my room, in the shadows on the stairs, standing at the window where she used to stand. She does not speak. She never spoke, not even when she was alive. But she watches me, always watches. I have tried to leave this house, but I cannot. Every time I pack my things, I think of her down there in the darkness alone, and I cannot bring myself to go. I am trapped here, as surely as she is. Journal entry, 15th October, 1871. I have stopped working. I have stopped eating. I do nothing but sit in this room and wait. For what? I do not know. For forgiveness, perhaps, though I do not deserve it. The final entry was dated 20th October, 1871. Journal entry, 20th October, 1871. I am leaving this journal here, hidden where no one will find it unless they are meant to. If you are reading this, you have found Marqueta. You know what I did. I cannot ask for forgiveness. I cannot undo what has been done. But please, please give her a proper burial. Let her rest in consecrated ground. Let her have the peace I denied her. That is all I ask. Od pus me. I set the pages down, my hands trembling. Christina Mala had hidden her niece's body in the cellar and then vanished. What had happened to her after that final entry, I didn't know. Perhaps she'd left Prague. Perhaps she'd killed herself. Perhaps she'd simply walked away and tried to forget. But Markéta had remained. For more than a decade, she'd lain in that hidden chamber, walled up in the darkness. And then the house had flooded, the Dvořáks had drowned, the building had been torn down and rebuilt. But Markéta was still there, still waiting. I looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. The girl, Markéta. She was staring at me with those hollow, dark eyes. "I understand now," I said quietly. "I know what happened to you, and I promise I'll make it right." She tilted her head slightly as if listening. "I'll give you a proper burial. I'll tell the authorities. I'll make sure you're laid to rest the way you should have been." For a long moment, she didn't move. And then, slowly, she nodded once and disappeared. Chapter 10. The Authorities. The next morning, I went to the police. The station was a stolid gray building near the old town square, its windows narrow and its entrance guarded by two uniformed men who looked at me with mild suspicion as I approached. I asked to speak with someone in authority, and after a brief wait, I was ushered into a cramped office on the second floor. The man behind the desk was in his 50s, with a thick mustache and tired eyes. He introduced himself as Inspector Willem Kral and gestured for me to sit. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ashford?" "Samuel Ashford. I live on Řetězová Street, number 14. He pulled out a notebook and a pencil. "Go on." I took a breath. "I've found human remains in the cellar of my house, a child's body. It's been there for years, more than a decade, I believe." His expression didn't change, but his pencil paused over the page. "You're certain it's human remains?" "Yes. I found a hidden chamber in the cellar. The body is wrapped in cloth and partially buried in dirt. And I found a journal that explains what happened. The child's name was Markéta Malá. She died in 1871 and was hidden there by her aunt." Kral studied me carefully. "And you just discovered this?" "Yes, a few days ago. I've been trying to understand what I found before coming to you." "Why didn't you come immediately?" "Because..." I hesitated. How could I explain about the dreams, the ghost, the feeling that I needed to know the full story before involving the authorities? Because I wanted to be certain of the facts. I didn't want to waste your time with speculation. He didn't look convinced, but he made a note in his book. "This journal you mentioned, do you have it?" "Yes, it's in Czech. I had it translated. I can bring you both the original and the translation." "Please do. We'll need to see it." He stood. "I'll need to inspect the house and the remains immediately. Can you take me there now?" "Of course." Inspector Kral brought two other officers with him, a younger man named Novotny, and an older stooped fellow whose name I didn't catch. They followed me back to Řetězová Street in grim silence. Pani Zamanova was sweeping her step when we arrived. She looked up, saw the police uniforms, and her eyes went wide. She started to say something, but I shook my head slightly, and she retreated back into her house. I unlocked the door to number 14 and led the men inside. "The cellar is this way." I had moved the pile of bricks back against the wall after discovering the chamber, partly to hide the opening and partly because I couldn't bear to look at it. Now I moved them aside again, exposing the gap in the wall. Kral stepped forward with a lantern and peered inside. The younger officer, Novotny, did the same. After a long moment, Kral turned to me. "Stay here. Novotny, come with me. Tomášek." keep Mr. Ashford company." The older officer, Tomaszek apparently, nodded and positioned himself near the cellar stairs, watching me with flat, unreadable eyes. Kral and Novotny squeezed through the opening into the hidden chamber. I heard low voices, the sound of movement, the scrape of tools against stone. I waited. Time seemed to stretch impossibly. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, Kral emerged, his face grim. He was carrying something wrapped in a blanket, the cloth-wrapped form I'd seen in the chamber, now carefully bundled for transport. "We're taking this to the coroner," he said, "and we'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to make a formal statement. Bring the journal and anything else you found." "Of course. Will there be—" I hesitated. "Will there be an investigation?" "There will be an inquiry. We need to determine the cause of death, the identity of the child, and the circumstances of the burial. But based on what you've told me and what I've seen, I don't believe you're a suspect. The journal will help establish the timeline." I felt a wave of relief. "Thank you." He nodded curtly. "Stay available. We may have more questions." They left with the body, and I was alone in the house again. I stood in the parlor for a long time, staring at nothing. It was done. The authorities knew. Marketa would be properly buried. She would have peace. And yet I felt no sense of relief, only a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. I walked slowly through the house, checking each room, half expecting to see her standing in the doorway or at the foot of the stairs. But there was nothing. She was gone. Truly gone now. The house was empty. The inquiry took 3 days. I spent most of that time at the police station, answering questions, providing documents, explaining over and over again how I'd found the hidden chamber and the journal. Kral was thorough and professional, never accusatory, but never entirely trusting either. The coroner's report confirmed what I'd already known. The remains were those of a young girl approximately 7 years old who had died sometime in the 1870s. The cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty after so many years, but there were no signs of violence or trauma, most likely fever or illness, just as Christina's journal had described. The authorities also located records of Christina Mala. She had disappeared from Prague in late 1871, shortly after the last entry in her journal. No one knew where she'd gone or what had become of her. She was simply gone, leaving behind only her guilt and her hidden secret. On the 4th day, Kral called me back to his office. "We've closed the inquiry," he said. "The case is being classified as an unattended death from 1871. No criminal charges will be filed. Everyone involved is long dead. The child's remains will be released for burial." "Where will she be buried?" "In the public cemetery. There's a section for unclaimed remains. Unless—" He looked at me carefully. "Unless you wish to arrange for a private burial." I hadn't thought about that, but now that he'd said it, I knew it was the right thing to do. "Yes, I'll arrange it. She shouldn't be buried in an unmarked grave. She deserves better than that." Kral nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll have the remains transferred to a funeral home of your choosing. You can make the arrangements from there." I chose a small funeral home in Mala Strana, not far from Božena's house. The proprietor, a kind, soft-spoken man named František, helped me arrange everything. A simple coffin, a plot in the old Shanis cemetery in a quiet corner beneath an old oak tree, a small headstone with her name and dates. Marketa Mala, 1864, 1871, Odpoczywaj w pokoju. Rest in peace. The burial took place on a cold, gray morning a week later. Only a handful of people attended, myself, František, the priest from St. Giles, who had agreed to perform the service, and, to my surprise, Božena. She'd appeared at the cemetery gates just as we were preparing to begin, dressed in dark clothes and carrying a small bouquet of dried herbs tied with string. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "I thought she should not be buried alone." I nodded, too moved to speak. The service was brief. The priest said prayers in Latin and Czech while we stood in the cold wind. Božena placed her bouquet on a small coffin before it was lowered into the ground. I added a single white flower, a lily I'd bought from a street vendor that morning. As the groundskeepers began filling in the grave, I found myself whispering words I hadn't planned to say. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what happened to you. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to make it right. But you're safe now. You can rest now." The wind carried my words away, and for just a moment I thought I saw something, a flicker at the edge of my vision, a small shape standing beneath the oak tree. But when I blinked, it was gone. Božena walked with me back toward the cemetery gates. "You did a good thing," she said. "Not many people would have taken the time or the expense." It was the least I could do. She'd been waiting so long. She was lucky you found her, lucky you cared enough to listen. We walked in silence for a while. "Will she be at peace now?" I asked. "Is it truly over?" Božena looked at me with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "Yes, she accepted your help. She wanted to be found, to be buried properly. Now that it's done, she has no reason to remain. And the house. The house is just a house now, nothing more." I wanted to believe her, and mostly I did. But there was still one thing that troubled me. "What about the Dvořáks?" I asked. "They drowned in that house. And then Markéta was hidden in the cellar beneath them. Do you think they knew? Do you think that's why they were trapped there?" Božena frowned, considering this. "I don't know. The dead keep many secrets, but I think perhaps they were trapped by their own deaths, not by hers. The house held many sorrows, many tragedies. One death does not always explain another. But now, all of them are at peace. Yes, I believe so." We reached the gates, and she turned to face me. "What will you do now, Mr. Ashford? Will you stay in that house?" "I don't know. I haven't decided yet." She nodded. "Whatever you choose, remember this. A house is only as haunted as we allow it to be. If you fill it with fear and guilt, it will remain dark. But if you fill it with life, with light and warmth and ordinary human things, it will become just a place to live, nothing more. Thank you, Božena, for everything." She smiled faintly. "You're welcome. And if you ever need help again, though I hope you won't, you know where to find me." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the gray Prague afternoon. Chapter 11. The House Remembers. I returned to Řetězová Street late that afternoon, as the winter sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The house looked the same as it always had, narrow, unremarkable, wedged between its neighbors like a book on a crowded shelf. But as I stood on the cobblestones, staring up at it, I felt something different. Not menace, not dread, just weight. The weight of history, of lives lived and lost within those walls, of secrets buried and finally brought to light. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, in a way it had never been before. Not the oppressive silence of the first weeks, when I'd felt constantly watched and waited upon. Not the eerie stillness that had followed the Dvořák's departure, when every creak and shadow had made me jump. This was different. This was the ordinary quiet of an empty house on a winter afternoon. The kind of quiet that invites you to fill it with your own presence, rather than demanding you acknowledge something else's. I walked through the room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the window sills. Everything was solid and real and mine. The parlor where the Dvořáks had drowned, the kitchen where I'd seen their shadows, the stairs they'd climbed night after night in their endless futile loop, the cellar where Markéta had lain hidden for more than a decade. All of it was just space now. Empty space waiting to be filled with whatever I chose to put there. I found myself standing in the parlor, in the spot where the salt circle had been, where I'd seen both Tomáš and Anna, and later the small, silent figure of Markéta. "You're all at peace now," I said aloud. "All three of you. I hope you know that." No response, no flicker of presence, no cold draft or smell of water, just silence. I smiled, surprising myself, and went upstairs to make dinner. Over the next few weeks, I began to truly settle into the house. I bought new furniture, a proper desk for the second bedroom, comfortable chairs for the parlor, thick curtains to keep out the winter cold. I had the cellar sealed properly, the hidden chamber filled with brick and mortar so that no one would ever stumble upon it again. I even hired a woman from the neighborhood to come in twice a week to help with cleaning and cooking, filling the house with ordinary human activity. Slowly, room by room, I began to push back against the darkness that had defined the place for so long. I invited Pani Zemanová over for tea one afternoon. She'd been hesitant at first, eyeing the house with obvious trepidation, but when she finally agreed and stepped inside, I saw her shoulders relax. "It feels different," she said, looking around the parlor with something like wonder. "Lighter. It is lighter. The ghosts are gone." "All of them?" "All of them." She nodded slowly, sipping her tea. "You did a good thing, Mr. Ashford. Not many men would have taken such trouble. Most would have just sold the house and walked away. I thought about it, but this is my home now. I wasn't going to let the past drive me out." She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened her usually severe features. "Then I am glad you stayed. The street is better for it." Winter deepened, and Prague grew cold and white with snow. I fell into a comfortable routine. I continued my Czech lessons and could now hold basic conversations with shopkeepers and neighbors. I read voraciously. Books from the Linden Library, newspapers, anything I could get my hands on. I took long walks through the city, discovering hidden courtyards and quiet churches and narrow alleys that felt like doorways to earlier centuries. And in the evenings I returned to the house on Řetězová Street and felt, for the first time in my life, something like contentment. I wasn't entirely happy. Happiness seemed like too simple a word for what I felt, but I was at peace. I had survived something strange and terrible, and I had done the right thing in the end, and now I was learning how to live with the consequences. That seemed like enough. One evening in late January, about 2 months after Markéta's burial, I was sitting in the parlor reading when I heard a knock at the door. I set down my book and answered it. A young woman stood on the step, bundled in a dark coat and scarf, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked nervous, twisting her gloved hands together. "Mr. Ashford?" she asked in accented English. "Yes?" "I am sorry to disturb you. My name is Yana Svobodova. I am a descendant of the Dvořák family, of Anna Dvořák." I stared at her. A descendant? But I thought the record said they had no children. They did not. But Anna had a younger sister, my great-great-grandmother. I learned recently about what happened to Tomáš and Anna, and She hesitated. I wanted to see the house, to understand where they died. If that is all right. I stepped aside. "Of course, please come in." She entered slowly, looking around the parlor with wide eyes. "It looks so different from the photographs," she said quietly. "The house was torn down and rebuilt, yes?" "Yes, in 1881, 3 years after they died." She nodded, still looking around. "I have heard stories from my grandmother about how they drowned, how the neighbors did not help them, how they were trapped. I'm sorry," I said, "for what happened to them, and I'm sorry no one came to help." She turned to me, her eyes bright. "But they are at peace now, yes? I have felt it. Ever since I came to Prague, I have felt their presence less and less, as if they have finally let go. Yes, they're at peace. I helped them with the assistance of a wise woman. They were trapped, reliving their deaths over and over, but we freed them. They accepted what had happened and moved on." Jana smiled, and I saw tears on her cheeks. Thank you for doing that, for caring enough to help them. It was the right thing to do." She wiped her eyes and looked around the room one more time. May I have a moment alone, just to say goodbye to them?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." I stepped out into the hallway, giving her privacy. I waited perhaps 10 minutes before she emerged, composed but red-eyed. "Thank you," she said again. "I feel better now. I feel like I can let them rest." "I'm glad." She pulled a small package from her coat pocket. "I brought something for you, a gift, to thank you for what you did." She handed it to me, and I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small framed photograph. 2 people, a thin, serious-looking man and a smaller woman with a gentle smile, stood side by side in formal dress, staring at the camera with the stiff, uncomfortable expressions common to old portraits. "Tomáš and Anna," Jana said quietly. "Taken a few years before they died. I thought you should have it, so you can remember them as they were, not as ghosts, but as people." I stared at the photograph, feeling an unexpected surge of emotion. They looked so ordinary, so human, just 2 people trying to live their lives, unaware of the tragedy that waited for them. "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. "I'll treasure this." After Jana left, I hung the photograph in the parlor, on the wall near the window, where the hidden door had been. I stood back and looked at it for a long time. Tomáš and Anna Dvořák, dead for nearly 7 years now, but finally at rest, and Markéta, buried properly at last beneath the old oak tree in Olszany Cemetery. 3 souls who had been trapped by death and circumstance, who had lingered in this house for far too long, but who were finally free. I thought about Christina Malá, whoever and wherever she was. I wondered if she'd ever found peace, or if the guilt had followed her for the rest of her life. I hoped, for her sake, that she found some measure of forgiveness in the end, but I would never know. Some mysteries remain unsolved. Some questions have no answers, and perhaps that was all right. That night, I slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months. No footsteps, no voices, no cold water seeping through the floorboards, no small silent figure standing in doorways. Just sleep, pure and untroubled and restorative. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the bedroom window, and I could hear the sounds of the city waking up outside, carts rattling over cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, church bells ringing the hour. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of life going on. I got out of bed, dressed, and went downstairs to make breakfast. The house was warm and bright and mine, and I was no longer afraid. Chapter 12. The Spring Thaw. The winter passed slowly but not unpleasantly. I continued to settle into life in Prague, and a house on Řetězová Street became less a source of anxiety and more simply the place where I lived. I developed routines. Morning coffee in the kitchen while reading the newspaper, afternoon walks along the river, evenings spent reading or writing letters by lamplight. The neighbors grew accustomed to me. Pani Zamanova stopped regarding me with suspicion and instead would occasionally bring me pastries or invite me over for tea. The baker on the corner learned my preference for dark rye bread. The woman who sold flowers near the Charles Bridge greeted me by name. I was becoming part of the fabric of the city, woven in slowly but securely. And the house, for its part, remained peacefully, ordinarily, wonderfully quiet. In early March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring crept into the air, I received an unexpected visitor. František Novak appeared at my door one afternoon looking much the same as he had when I'd first met him, round-faced, damp around the forehead, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Ashford," he said, removing his hat, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all. Please come in." He entered, looking around the parlor with obvious curiosity. I could see him noting the new furniture, the curtains, the photograph of Tomasz and Anna on the wall. "The house looks well," he said. "You've made it comfortable." "Thank you. It's been an adjustment, but I'm settled now." He nodded, still glancing around. "I heard there was some trouble with the police, an investigation." So that was why he'd come. Gossip traveled fast in this part of the city. "There was an investigation, yes. I found human remains in the cellar. A child who had been hidden there many years ago. The authorities were satisfied that I had nothing to do with it." Novak's face went pale. "Human remains? In the cellar?" "Yes, from 1871, long before you bought the property." He was silent for a moment, working his jaw. I had no idea. When I purchased the house and had it rebuilt, the workmen never mentioned finding anything." "They wouldn't have. The chamber was hidden behind a wall. It was sealed up deliberately to conceal what was inside." He sat down heavily in one of my chairs, looking genuinely shaken. "My God! And the Dvořáks, they lived here not knowing there was a body beneath them?" "I believe so, though I can't be certain." I studied his face carefully. "Mr. Novak, when you bought this property in 1881, did you know about the Dvořáks' deaths? About how they died?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I knew. Everyone in the neighborhood knew. That's why the house had stood empty for so long. People were afraid of it." "But you bought it anyway." "I bought it cheap, very cheap, and I thought that by tearing it down and rebuilding I could erase what had happened, make it clean again. He looked up at me, his expression miserable. But I should have told you. When you bought it from me, I should have told you about the Dvořáks, about the flooding, about what people said. What did people say? That the house was cursed, that the dead still walked there, that anyone who lived in it would be haunted by what had happened. He shook his head. I thought it was superstition, old women's tales. I never believed in ghosts. And now? He looked at me intently. Have you seen them? The Dvořáks? I considered lying, but what was the point? He'd come here looking for the truth. Yes, I saw them. They were trapped here, reliving their deaths every night. But they're gone now. They've moved on. Novak stared at me, his face a mixture of fear and fascination. How? How did you make them leave? I had help from someone who understands these things better than I do. We helped them remember what had happened to them, helped them accept it, and then they were able to rest. He was quiet for a long time, absorbing this. I'm sorry, he finally said. I should have been honest with you from the start. I should have told you everything. Yes, you should have, but what's done is done. The house is at peace now, and so am I. He nodded, standing. If there's anything I can do, anything at all, to make amends, there's nothing. But thank you for coming. I appreciate the honesty, even if it came late. He left shortly after, and I watched him walk away down Řetězová street, his shoulders hunched and his steps heavy. I felt sorry for him in a way. He'd thought he could bury the past under new walls and fresh plaster. But the past has a way of persisting, of seeping through even the strongest foundations. Some truths cannot be rebuilt away. As March turned to April, the city bloomed. Trees along the river burst into green. Flowers appeared in window boxes and small gardens. The air grew warmer, and people emerged from their winter hibernation to fill the streets and squares with noise and movement. I found myself spending more time outside, exploring parts of Prague I hadn't yet seen. I climbed Petrin Hill and looked out over the sprawling city below. I visited the art galleries and museums in the new town. I sat in beer gardens and practiced my Czech with friendly strangers who found my accent amusing but tried to hide their smiles. Life felt possible again, not just bearable, but genuinely good. The house remained my anchor, the place I returned to each evening with relief and contentment. I'd grown fond of it in a way I hadn't expected. Yes, terrible things had happened there, but I'd also helped set them right. I'd given rest to the restless and peace to the trapped. That meant something. It changed the character of the place from cursed to cleansed, or so I told myself. One evening in late April, I was sitting in the parlor reading when I felt a sudden chill, not the oppressive water-laden cold of the Dvořáks, not the hollow emptiness that had accompanied Markéta's presence, just cold, as if someone had opened a window. I looked up from my book. The room was empty. The windows were closed. Everything was exactly as it should be, but the cold remained. I stood and walked slowly around the room, checking for drafts, for gaps in the walls or floor. Nothing. The cold intensified near the photograph of Tomáš and Anna. I stopped in front of it, studying their serious faces, and then I heard it, a whisper, faint and distant, like wind through leaves. Tekuji. Thank you. I stood very still, my heart beating fast. Tomáš? Anna? No response, just silence. The cold began to fade. Within moments, the room had returned to its normal temperature. I stared at the photograph for a long time, wondering if I'd imagined it, if exhaustion or imagination had conjured a voice where there was none. But I didn't think so. I thought they'd come back just for a moment to say goodbye properly, to acknowledge what I'd done for them, to offer thanks. And now they were truly gone. "You're welcome," I said quietly to the empty room. "Rest well." After that night, there were no more disturbances, no more cold spots, no more whispers, no more flickering presences at the edges of vision. The house became finally and completely just a house. I lived there for another year before circumstances called me back to England, a family matter that required my presence and couldn't be resolved from abroad. I sold the property to a young Czech couple who were expecting their first child. They were delighted with the house, with its solid construction and its convenient location. I told them nothing about its history, not about the Dvořáks or Markéta or Christina Malá. The past had been dealt with. The dead had been laid to rest. There was no reason to burden new tenants with old sorrows. But before I left, I did one last thing. I took the photograph of Tomáš and Anna off the wall and wrapped it carefully. I carried it to Olszany's cemetery and placed it at the base of the oak tree where Markéta was buried. "I thought you should all be together," I said, "in memory, if not in life." I stood there for a few minutes, looking at the three names I now knew by heart. Tomáš Dvořák, Anna Dvořák, Markéta Malá, three people who had suffered, who had died before their time, who had been trapped by circumstance and tragedy, but who were free now, thanks, in some small part, to me. I left Prague on a warm May morning, taking a train westward toward the German border and eventually to England. As the city receded behind me, the spires and red roofs growing smaller and smaller, I found myself thinking about the house on Řetězová Street, about the footsteps I'd heard in the night, the water rising through the floorboards, the silent watching figure of a dead child, the desperate scrawl in a hidden journal. All of it felt like a dream now, something that had happened to someone else in another life. But it had happened. I had the scars to prove it, the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the fear, and I had the memories too, of Božena's calm competence, of Pani Zemanov's rough kindness, of Jana's tearful gratitude, of doing something right when it would have been so much easier to do nothing at all. I didn't know if I'd ever return to Prague. Life has a way of carrying us in unexpected directions. But I knew that somewhere in the old town, on a narrow street of tall, leaning houses, number 14 stood peacefully in the spring sunlight, empty of ghosts, full of possibilities, waiting for the next chapter of its long, strange history to begin. Tas epilogue, the letter. 5 years later, I received a letter. It arrived at my London address on a gray autumn morning, forwarded from a Prague postal office I vaguely recognized. The handwriting on the envelope was careful and precise, the kind that suggested education and attention to detail. I opened it at my breakfast table, curious. Dear Mr. Ashford, my name is Clara Novotna. You do not know me, but I believe I know you, or at least I know your story. I am a historian specializing in Prague's old town, particularly in the houses and families that inhabited the district during the 19th century. Recently, while researching property records for a book I am writing, I came across the history of Řetězová Street, number 14. What I found fascinated me: the deaths of Tomáš and Anna Dvořák in 1878, the hidden chamber and the remains of Markéta Malá, the journal of Kristina Malá, and most intriguingly, the role you played in bringing these stories to light. I have interviewed several people who remember the events: Pani Zemanova, now quite elderly but still sharp, the police inspector who handled the case, and even Jana Svobodova, who told me about her visit to the house. They all spoke highly of you and the care you took to ensure the dead were properly laid to rest. I am writing to ask if you would be willing to correspond with me about your experiences. I believe your story, the story of a house haunted not by evil, but by sorrow and neglect, deserves to be told, not sensationalized, but recorded honestly as part of the city's history. If you are willing, I would be honored to include your account in my research. And if you prefer to remain anonymous, I will, of course, respect that wish. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that the house continues to thrive. The couple who bought it from you still live there with their children. 3 now, I believe. It is a happy home, full of laughter and light. The dead rest peacefully, and the living go on. With gratitude and respect, Klara Novotna. I set the letter down and stared out the window at the gray London sky. A happy home, full of laughter and light. That was all I'd wanted. For the house to be clean. For the past to be acknowledged and then released. For life to continue without the burden of old tragedies weighing it down. And it had worked. I picked up my pen and began to write a reply. Dear Mrs. Novotna, thank you for your letter. I would be honored to share my story with you, though I cannot promise it will be entirely coherent. Some of what I experienced still defies rational explanation, even after all these years. I will tell you everything I remember about the footsteps and the water, about Bozhena and the ritual, about finding Markéta and ensuring she received the burial she deserved. I do not consider myself a hero. I simply did what needed to be done. But if my story can help others understand that the dead are not always malevolent, that sometimes they are simply lost and in need of help, then I am glad to tell it. Please send me your questions and I will answer them as best I can. And thank you for telling me about the house, for telling me it is full of laughter now. That means more to me than you might imagine. With warm regards, Samuel Ashford. I sealed the letter and posted it that afternoon, and that night, for the first time in years, I dreamed of Prague, not of ghosts or water or hidden chambers, but of sunlight on cobblestones, of the Charles Bridge at dawn, of narrow streets winding upward toward the castle, of a house on Řetězová Street, its windows warm with lamplight, its rooms full of voices, of life continuing, of the dead finally at rest. The end. Hey, it's the Midnight Narrator again. If you made it all the way through this story, through the flooded parlors and hidden chambers, through Tomáš and Anna's endless drowning, and little Markéta's long, lonely wait, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me through the dark parts and the sad parts and the parts where nothing quite made sense until it finally did. I hope you sleep well tonight. I hope your dreams are gentle. And I hope that if you ever find yourself in a house that feels heavy with history, You'll remember Samuel Ashford and the choice he made not to run, but to listen, not to fear, but to help. The dead aren't always our enemies. Sometimes they're just people who got lost along the way. And sometimes, if we're brave enough and kind enough, we can help them find their way home. Good night. Sleep tight, and I'll see you in the next story.